My name is Madeline Harper. I am 29 years old now, and there was a night when my parents opened the front door and sent me into a blizzard that could have killed me. I was 16. The temperature outside was nearly 15 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that makes the air feel sharp in your lungs. Snow was blowing sideways across the streetlights of Aspen Hollow, Colorado, piling into drifts that swallowed the sidewalks and buried the edges of the road. Inside our living room, the fire in the stone fireplace glowed warm and steady, the windows fogged with heat, and my little sister Chloe was crying on the couch like the world had just ended. My father stood near the door with his hand on the handle. His voice was colder than the storm outside. "Get out of this house now," he said. The wind screamed the moment he pulled the door open. Snow burst into the hallway like white smoke. I tried to explain that I hadn't done what Chloe said I did, that the recording she played for them was edited, that the broken necklace had nothing to do with me. But my parents had already decided who they believed. When the door slammed behind me, I stood alone in a -15-degree blizzard with nothing but a thin coat and the realization that my family had just erased me. Years later, when I stepped onto a stage in front of thousands of people as the keynote speaker at a national education conference, my parents were sitting in the audience. And when they finally recognized me, they went completely silent. But that night in Aspen Hollow began like any other winter evening, and that was what made it so surreal. The storm had been building all afternoon. The wind rattled the pine trees outside and carried snow across the windows in swirling waves. Weather alerts had been flashing across the television, warning people to stay indoors. Our house felt warm and safe in comparison. The fireplace crackled softly. The kitchen smelled faintly like cinnamon tea my mother had made earlier. From the outside, the Harper home looked like every other quiet house on that street. Inside, everything was about to break apart. I was standing near the staircase when I first heard Chloe crying. Not the quiet kind of crying people do when they are embarrassed, but the loud, desperate kind that fills an entire room. My mother was sitting beside her on the couch, stroking her hair and whispering softly. My father stood a few feet away with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. The moment I walked into the living room, all three of them turned toward me. Something about the way they looked at me made my stomach drop. "What happened?" I asked. My father's voice was low and controlled. "You tell us." I blinked, confused. "Tell you what." Chloe slowly lifted her head from my mother's shoulder. Her mascara had run slightly under her eyes, and her voice trembled in exactly the way it did whenever she wanted someone to believe she was fragile. "Why would you do that to me?" she whispered. My mind went blank. "Do what?" "You ruined my audition today," she said. "You told people I only get parts because I flirt with boys, and then you pushed me." The words felt so unreal that for a moment I thought I had misheard them. "That didn't happen," I said immediately. "Chloe, I wasn't even near the theater room today." Her crying grew louder. My mother wrapped her arms around her again. "Madeline," she said quietly, "please don't make this worse." "I'm not making anything worse," I said, feeling panic rising in my chest. "I didn't do any of that." Chloe reached for her phone on the coffee table with shaking hands. "Then, explain this." She tapped the screen and held the phone out toward our father. An audio clip began playing. My own voice filled the room, sounding irritated and dismissive. In the recording, it sounded like I was mocking Chloe's acting ambitions, like I thought the whole theater program was a joke. "That's not the full conversation," I said quickly. "It's edited." My father's eyes hardened. "Are you calling your sister a liar?" "I'm saying someone cut parts out," I replied. "You have to listen to me." Chloe reached into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out a broken silver necklace. The chain hung in 2 pieces between her fingers. "She grabbed it during the fight," Chloe said through tears. "It snapped when she shoved me." I stared at the necklace. "I didn't touch that." Chloe slowly rolled up the sleeve of her sweater. A dark bruise marked her elbow. My father looked at it, and his expression changed instantly. "Madeline," he said, his voice suddenly cold with disappointment. "I expected better from you." "I didn't push her," I said, my voice cracking despite how hard I tried to keep it steady. "You have to believe me!" The wind slammed against the windows, rattling the glass. Snow streaked past the porch light outside. For a moment I thought someone would pause, that one of them would ask questions or check the story. Instead, my father walked to the front door. The lock clicked loudly in the quiet room. When he opened the door, freezing wind and snow rushed into the hallway like a living thing. "If you can't treat your sister with respect," he said, "you don't belong in this house tonight." The words hit harder than the cold air. I stood there for a second, waiting for the rest of the sentence, for the moment when he would say he didn't mean it. It never came. I pulled my coat from the hook by the door with shaking hands. The zipper kept catching as my fingers trembled. I looked back once more, hoping my mother would say something, anything. She didn't meet my eyes. She was still holding Chloe, so I stepped outside. The blizzard swallowed me instantly. Wind tore at my hair and coat, and snow blasted across my face so hard it felt like needles. Behind me, the door slammed shut with a heavy echo. For a few seconds, I stood on the porch, waiting. Surely someone would open the door again. Instead, the porch light flicked off. Darkness closed around the house like it had never been mine. That was the moment I understood something I had never allowed myself to believe before. I wasn't being punished. I was being erased, and I had no idea yet that the storm I was walking into was about to change the rest of my life forever. The wind pushed against me the moment I stepped off the porch, snow swirling across the street like white smoke. I remember thinking that if I could just reach the bus stop a few blocks away, everything would somehow make sense again. But the truth is that night didn't begin with the blizzard. It began years earlier, in moments so small that at the time I didn't recognize them for what they were. Walking through the storm, I kept replaying the argument in my head, wondering how everything had fallen apart so quickly. The older version of me knows something different. That night was not sudden. It was the final piece of a pattern that had been growing quietly inside our house for years. The first time I understood that pattern, I was 13 years old. My English teacher had announced the winners of the National Young Writers Award during class, a competition open to middle school students across the country. My story had been selected out of thousands of submissions. When she read my name out loud, the entire classroom turned toward me. I remember my face burning with a mix of disbelief and pride. For days afterward, I carried the certificate in my backpack, waiting for the right moment to show my parents. When I finally ran through the front door of our house in Aspen Hollow with the paper in my hands, my mother was standing in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner. "Mom, I won," I said breathlessly. "First place. It's a national competition." She turned around, surprised, and her face lit up. "Madeline, that's incredible," she said, pulling me into a quick hug. For a moment, everything felt perfect. Then the front door opened again. Chloe walked in crying. Her cheerleading bag dropped onto the floor as she rushed into the living room. "I didn't make the team," she sobbed. The shift in the room was immediate. My mother let go of me and hurried after her. "Oh, sweetheart, what happened?" she asked gently. I stood in the kitchen holding the certificate while their voices carried from the next room. By the time my father came home from work, the entire evening had become about comforting Chloe. They ordered her favorite takeout and spent dinner reassuring her that she would have another chance next year. My certificate stayed on the counter beside the sink. No one asked about it again. The next morning, it had been moved under a pile of unopened mail. That night taught me something no one ever said out loud. In our house, achievements could wait. Chloe's feelings could not. At first, I tried to ignore the pattern. Families weren't perfect. Siblings fought. Parents got distracted. That was what I told myself every time a moment felt unfair. But the pattern kept repeating. When I brought home straight A report cards, my father nodded and said he expected nothing less. When Chloe failed a math test, the entire weekend turned into a family effort to cheer her up. When I won a small regional science competition, my parents congratulated me quickly before asking whether Chloe needed help preparing for a dance recital. Over time, I began to understand that being the reliable one made me almost invisible. Chloe was sensitive. My mother often explained gently. She needed more support. I became the child who didn't. By the time I reached high school, I had stopped expecting much attention at home. Instead, I found it somewhere else. The robotics club at Aspen Hollow High School met every afternoon in a small lab filled with half-built machines and scattered wires. The moment I walked into that room, everything felt different. Programming came naturally to me. I loved the challenge of solving problems that seemed impossible at first. Our team had qualified for the Colorado State Robotics Championship that year, and the entire group was working late hours preparing for it. Lucas Bennett, the team captain, relied heavily on my coding skills to stabilize the robot's control system. "You just saved us 2 weeks of work," he said once after I fixed a complicated bug in the navigation software. Moments like that made me feel something I rarely felt at home. Valued. One afternoon, I was leaving the robotics lab with Lucas after another long practice session. We were discussing a problem with the robot's sensors when he laughed at one of my sarcastic comments. As we turned down the hallway, I noticed someone standing near the lockers at the far end. Chloe. She was supposed to be meeting a friend after school, but instead, she was watching us. I waved casually. "Hey!" I called. She didn't wave back. Her expression was strangely blank, like she was trying to memorize something. I thought maybe she was embarrassed about being seen near the robotics lab. Later that evening, she asked a question at dinner that caught me off guard. "Do you and Lucas talk a lot?" she said, stirring her food without looking up. "Only about robotics," I answered honestly. "He's the team captain. We're preparing for the competition." Chloe nodded but didn't say anything else. I assumed she was curious because she had a crush on him. Looking back now, that conversation meant more than I realized. Over the next few days, Chloe asked several more questions about Lucas. What classes he took, whether he ever attended the theater performances at school, whether he seemed nice. I answered without thinking much about it. I even told her she should try talking to him if she liked him. She smiled faintly, but her eyes looked distant, like she was already somewhere else in her mind. At the time, I believed I was helping my sister. What I didn't understand was that Chloe was no longer reacting emotionally. She was observing, and that quiet shift was the beginning of something I wouldn't recognize until it was far too late. The snow stung my face as the wind pushed me farther down the street, but my mind kept drifting back to the months before that night. At 16, I still believed that most problems inside a family eventually worked themselves out. What I didn't understand yet was how quietly resentment can grow when someone decides they need to win a story instead of tell the truth. Chloe had always been emotional, but after she started asking about Lucas Bennett, something about her changed in a way I didn't immediately notice. At first, the questions seemed harmless. She asked whether Lucas talked about theater, whether he ever mentioned going to the winter play auditions, whether he had a girlfriend. I answered casually while doing homework at the kitchen table. "You should just talk to him," I said one evening. "He's actually pretty nice." Chloe gave a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Maybe I will," she replied quietly. A few days later, I realized she had started appearing in places she had never shown interest in before. One afternoon, when our robotics team stayed late to test the navigation program, I walked out of the lab to find Chloe standing near the hallway water fountain. She wasn't talking to anyone. She was simply leaning against the wall, watching. Lucas noticed her first. "Is that your sister?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, surprised. "Chloe, what are you doing here?" She straightened quickly. "I was just waiting for a friend," she said. Her voice sounded too casual, like someone reading from a script. Lucas smiled politely and introduced himself. Chloe's cheeks turned slightly pink as she shook his hand. For a moment, everything seemed normal. But later that night, I noticed her scrolling through her phone at the dinner table with a strange concentration. When I walked past her chair, the screen flashed briefly before she locked it. I didn't think much about it at the time. A week later, something else happened that should have warned me things were shifting in a darker direction. My mother kept an old film camera in the hallway cabinet. It had belonged to her father and was one of the few sentimental things she talked about often. One evening, she discovered it missing. The entire house turned upside down as my parents searched every room. Chloe stood near the doorway, watching quietly while they looked through drawers and closets. "Madeline was in the hallway earlier," she said suddenly. Her voice was calm, almost helpful. My father looked at me. "Did you move the camera?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, I haven't touched it." Chloe shrugged slightly. "Maybe I saw wrong," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't believe that. The search continued for nearly an hour before my father finally told me to stay home from a friend's birthday party that weekend until the camera was found. "If you took it by accident, just say so," he said. I insisted again that I hadn't touched it. 2 days later, the camera appeared inside Chloe's own closet behind a stack of sweaters. No one apologized. My father simply said, "Maybe it was misplaced." Chloe didn't comment at all. When our parents weren't looking, she gave me a small, thoughtful smile that made my stomach tighten. By the time winter approached, our robotics team had entered the most intense phase of preparation for the Colorado State Championship. Every afternoon, the lab buzzed with activity. Wires covered the tables, laptops glowed with lines of code, and our robot rolled clumsily across the floor while we tested new commands. Lucas trusted me with the entire control system because I was the only one who understood the navigation algorithm completely. "If we win this year, it'll be because of you," he said once, while we worked late into the evening. I laughed it off, but hearing that meant more to me than he probably realized. Outside the robotics lab, Chloe's world revolved around the theater program. The winter play auditions were approaching, and she had been rehearsing constantly. My parents talked about it every night at dinner. "This could be her big chance," my mother said proudly. Chloe practiced dramatic monologues in the living room, while my father watched with an encouraging smile. I stayed quiet, finishing homework and occasionally offering polite applause when she asked for feedback. A few days before the auditions, Chloe asked if she could borrow one of my sweaters. "It looks more serious than my clothes," she explained while standing in my doorway. I handed it to her without hesitation. Later that evening, I heard her in the kitchen talking quietly on the phone. When I walked in, she ended the call quickly and smiled. "Just a friend from drama club," she said. The next afternoon, Lucas texted me about a bug in the robot's sensor program. We exchanged several messages while trying to solve it. When I arrived home, Chloe was sitting at the dining table scrolling through her phone again. She looked up when I walked past. "You talk to Lucas a lot," she said casually. "Only about robotics," I replied. She nodded slowly as if filing that information away. The night before the storm, the weather forecast warned of heavy snowfall moving toward Aspen Hollow. My father checked the emergency supplies in the garage while my mother brought extra blankets into the living room. Chloe spent most of the evening in her bedroom, rehearsing for the audition scheduled the following afternoon. At one point, I heard something fall loudly upstairs, followed by a sharp curse under her breath. When she came downstairs later, her expression looked unusually calm. Too calm. She sat beside our mother on the couch and watched the news report about the approaching blizzard. Outside, the first flakes of snow drifted across the streetlights like scattered sparks. None of us knew yet that the storm building over the mountains would trap the entire town overnight. And none of us realized that Chloe had already finished preparing the story that would destroy everything inside our house. By the time the storm reached Aspen Hollow, the entire town seemed to disappear under white. Snow fell so heavily that the streetlights outside our windows looked like blurred halos glowing through a curtain. The wind howled around the corners of the house, rattling the gutters and shaking the branches of the pine trees in the yard. Inside, everything felt strangely calm. My mother had made soup for dinner, and the fireplace burned steadily in the living room. Chloe barely spoke during the meal. She sat quietly, staring at her bowl, while my parents asked gentle questions about her theater audition scheduled for the next afternoon. "I think I'm ready," she said softly, though something about her voice felt distant, almost rehearsed. I remember noticing that she kept touching the necklace around her neck, a delicate silver chain with a small charm my grandmother had given her years earlier. At the time, I thought she was nervous about the audition. After dinner, I went upstairs to finish a programming assignment for the robotics team. The lab computers had crashed earlier that day, so I was rewriting parts of the control code on my laptop. Outside, the wind grew stronger. Snow tapped steadily against my bedroom window like tiny stones. Around 8 o'clock, I heard something downstairs that made me pause. Chloe was crying again, not the quiet sniffles I had grown used to over the years, but loud sobs echoing through the house. My mother's voice followed quickly, alarmed and urgent. "Chloe, what happened?" The sound of footsteps moved across the floor as my father joined them. Then his voice carried up the staircase, sharp and commanding. "Madeline, come down here." My hands felt suddenly cold as I closed my laptop. Something about his tone told me this was not a simple misunderstanding. When I walked into the living room, the scene looked almost identical to the one that would replay in my memory for years afterward. Chloe sat curled on the couch, her face buried against my mother's shoulder. My father stood beside the fireplace with his arms crossed tightly over his chest. All three of them turned toward me the moment I stepped into the room. "Tell them," my father said, quietly. Chloe lifted her head slowly. Her eyes were red and glossy, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Why would you do that to me?" she whispered. The question hit me with such confusion that for a moment I didn't even understand what she was accusing me of. "What are you talking about?" I asked. Chloe grabbed her phone from the coffee table with trembling fingers. "You told people at school that I cheated to get parts in plays," she said. "You told Lucas Bennett that I'm fake." My heart skipped. "I never said that," I replied immediately. "Why would I say anything to Lucas about theater?" Chloe pressed a button on her phone and held it toward my father. A voice recording filled the room. My own voice. It sounded irritated, dismissive, as if I were mocking Chloe's acting ambitions and calling the theater program pointless. My stomach dropped. "That's not the full conversation," I said quickly. "It's edited." My father's expression darkened. "So now the recording is fake too?" he said. "Please just listen to me," I insisted. "Someone cut the audio. I would never say that." Chloe's crying grew louder. "You've been texting Lucas for weeks," she said between sobs. "You wanted him to think I'm pathetic." I shook my head in disbelief. Lucas and I talk about robotics, I said.
That's it.
Chloe slowly lifted her sleeve. A dark bruise marked the side of her arm. Then explain this, she whispered. My heart pounded harder. I didn't do that, I said. You shoved me during the fight in the hallway. Chloe continued softly. I hit the table. The room seemed to tilt around me. There was no fight, I said. You're lying. The moment the word left my mouth, silence crashed into the room. My father stepped forward sharply. Enough, he said. Lightning flashed outside the windows, illuminating the swirling snow. My mother avoided my eyes completely, focusing only on Chloe as she stroked her hair. Madeline, she said quietly, this behavior is getting worse. Behavior. The word made my chest tighten painfully. I didn't do any of this, I said again, though my voice sounded weaker now. Then why does it keep happening? My father replied. Why do problems keep following you? I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. I realized suddenly that no one in the room was waiting for my explanation anymore. Their minds were already made up. Chloe peeked briefly through her fingers. For a split second, her tears stopped. Her expression turned calm, almost satisfied, before she buried her face against my mother again. A cold chill moved through me that had nothing to do with the storm outside. My father walked toward the front door slowly. The metal handle clicked loudly as he unlocked it. You need time to think about what you've done, he said. When the door opened, the blizzard roared into the hallway. Snow scattered across the hardwood floor, and the freezing wind rushed through the house. I stared at him, waiting for the moment when he would stop, when he would realize how insane this looked. It's -15 outside, I said weakly. You should have thought about that before hurting your sister, he replied. I turned toward my mother, silently begging her to say something. She tightened her arm around Chloe and looked away. My hands trembled as I grabbed my coat from the hook beside the door. I moved slowly on purpose, stretching every second into hope. Surely someone would stop this before it went too far. No one did. I stepped onto the porch. Snow whipped across my face instantly. The wind was so strong it nearly pushed me backward. I turned one last time toward the doorway. Chloe lifted her head. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Her crying stopped completely. The calm look on her face lasted less than a second before she buried herself against my mother again. The door slammed shut behind me. I stood there in the blizzard, staring at the house I had lived in my entire life. Warm light glowed through the curtains. Shadows moved inside as my family continued their evening without me. I waited, counting silently in my head, convinced the door would open again. Instead, the porch light flicked off. Darkness swallowed the house. That was the moment I realized something that would take years to fully understand. My parents hadn't just punished me. They had chosen a version of the story where I didn't belong anymore. And the storm outside was only the beginning of what that choice would cost all of us. The cold hit me like a wall the moment I stepped off the porch. Wind tore through the street, lifting snow into violent spirals that blurred everything beyond a few feet. My boots sank immediately into the thick drifts piling along the walkway. For a few seconds, I stood there, frozen, staring at the dark shape of the house behind me, waiting for the door to open again. Surely my father would step outside and say this had gone too far. Surely my mother would run out with a blanket or call me back inside. The porch light flicked off instead. The sudden darkness made the house look unfamiliar, like a place I had never belonged to at all. I pulled my coat tighter around myself, though the thin fabric did almost nothing against the bitter wind. Snow stung my face as I stepped down the driveway and onto the empty street. Aspen Hollow was usually quiet in winter, but that night it looked completely abandoned. The blizzard had swallowed the town. Streetlights glowed dimly through thick curtains of snow, while the wind pushed loose branches across the pavement. My phone buzzed weakly in my pocket when I checked the time. The battery indicator blinked red. 8%. I scrolled through my contacts with shaking fingers and called the first name that came to mind. My best friend, Emma. The call rang twice before dropping straight to voicemail. I tried another friend from school. No answer again. Most people were probably already asleep, safe inside warm houses while the storm raged outside. I stared at the dark screen for a moment before slipping the phone back into my pocket. The bus station sat nearly 3 kilometers away near the edge of town. I had no clear plan beyond reaching it. Maybe it would still be open. Maybe there would be someone there who could help me figure out what to do next. The wind pushed against me as I began walking down the road. Each step felt heavier than the last as snow drifted around my legs. My breath came out in short white clouds that disappeared instantly into the storm. After a few minutes, the cold began creeping through my coat and into my arms. I told myself this wasn't permanent. Parents didn't really abandon their kids during blizzards. At some point, my father would calm down. At some point, my mother would realize how dangerous this was and call me back home. That was what I kept repeating in my head as I walked. But the farther I moved away from the house, the more uncertain those thoughts became. The storm grew louder, wind roaring between the houses like a living thing. Snow whipped sideways across the road, blinding me whenever I tried to look ahead. My fingers were already beginning to lose feeling inside my gloves. I shoved my hands deeper into my pockets and kept moving, forcing my legs to stay steady. After nearly 20 minutes, my cheeks felt numb and my ears burned painfully from the cold. The quiet streets stretched endlessly ahead, broken only by the occasional flicker of a porch light or the dark outline of parked cars buried in snow. At one intersection, I paused to catch my breath and leaned against a mailbox half buried in a drift. The cold had begun creeping deeper into my chest, making each breath feel tight and heavy. I pulled my phone out again, hoping the battery might still have enough power for one more call. The screen lit briefly before flashing the warning. 5%. I hesitated before dialing my father's number. The call connected instantly, ringing once, twice. Then it stopped. A message appeared across the screen. Call declined. I stared at the words for several seconds before the phone went dark completely. The battery had died. The realization settled slowly in my mind. There was no one coming to get me. I pushed myself away from the mailbox and stepped back into the storm. My legs felt heavier now, slower. Snow had already soaked through the bottom of my jeans, and icy water clung to my skin. The wind grew stronger as the road curved toward the edge of town. I could barely see the next streetlight ahead through the swirling white. Somewhere in the distance, a loose metal sign banged repeatedly against a pole, the sharp clanging echoing through the storm. I focused on that sound, using it as a rhythm to keep moving forward. Step, breath, step, breath. After a while, the cold stopped hurting as much. Instead, a strange numbness began spreading through my arms and legs. My thoughts felt slower too, drifting in and out like fragments of a dream. I knew enough about winter storms to understand what that meant. Hypothermia. But the word felt distant, like something from a textbook rather than my own life. I stumbled once, catching myself against a snowbank before falling. My boots slipped constantly against the frozen road. The world had narrowed into a tunnel of white and wind. Somewhere ahead, a pair of headlights suddenly appeared through the storm. The bright beams cut through the darkness, reflecting off the swirling snow and turning the entire road into a blinding glow. I froze for a second, unsure whether to move or stay still. The car was coming fast, tires crunching through the icy slush. I tried to step backward, but my foot slid on the frozen pavement. A horn blasted loudly, sharp and desperate. The headlights grew larger, brighter. Everything happened at once. I lost my balance, and the world tilted sideways. The sound of tires skidding across ice filled the air as the vehicle swerved sharply. For one brief second, I felt weightless, like the ground had vanished beneath me. Then, the impact came. My body slammed against the side of the road, and the cold asphalt rushed up to meet me. The wind roared above as snow fell across my face. I tried to move, but my limbs felt distant, heavy, like they no longer belonged to me. Somewhere nearby, a car door slammed open. Footsteps crunched quickly through the snow. A voice cut through the storm, urgent and shocked. "Oh my God, stay still!" Warm hands hovered near my shoulders as someone knelt beside me. "Can you hear me?" I tried to answer, but only a weak sound escaped my throat. My vision blurred as snowflakes drifted across the dim glow of the headlights. The woman leaned closer, her dark hair soaked with snow, her eyes wide with concern. "I'm calling an ambulance," she said quickly. "Just stay with me." Sirens echoed faintly in the distance as the cold darkness began closing in around the edges of my vision. The last thing I remember before everything went black was her voice again, steady and determined. "You're not alone now. I'm right here." The first thing I heard was a slow, rhythmic beeping. It echoed somewhere above me, steady and distant, like a metronome marking time in a room I couldn't yet see. My eyelids felt impossibly heavy, and when I finally managed to open them, the world appeared in fragments of bright white light and blurred shapes. The air smelled sharply of antiseptic. Something tugged gently at my arm when I tried to move. Tubes, machines, a hospital. My throat felt dry when I tried to speak. The only sound that came out was a weak rasp. A chair scraped softly beside the bed. "Hey," a calm voice said. "Easy." I turned my head slowly and saw the woman from the road sitting beside me. Her dark hair was tied back loosely now, and the worried tension I remembered from the storm had softened into relief. "You're safe," she said quietly. "You're in the hospital." My mind struggled to piece everything together. The blizzard, the road, the headlights, the cold that had seeped into my bones. "You stayed," I whispered. My voice barely sounded like mine. She nodded, simply. "Of course I did." The door opened and a nurse stepped inside, glancing at the monitor beside my bed. "She's awake," the nurse said gently. "How are you feeling?" I considered the question for a moment. Every part of my body ached in a dull, heavy way, especially my ribs and head. "Cold," I said quietly. The nurse smiled softly. "That's normal after severe hypothermia. You're lucky you were found when you were." I turned my head back toward the woman in the chair. "You were driving the truck," I said slowly. She nodded again. "My name is David Whitaker," she said. "I live just outside town. I saw you on the side of the road." The name sounded vaguely familiar, but my thoughts felt foggy. A doctor entered a few minutes later and explained that I had suffered a concussion, bruised ribs, and early-stage hypothermia. "If Mr. Whitaker had found you 15 minutes later, the outcome might have been very different," he said carefully. I listened without really absorbing the words. My mind was still stuck on the moment the door had slammed behind me. "Did you call my parents?" I asked quietly. The doctor exchanged a glance with David before answering. "They were contacted by the hospital earlier this morning." The door opened again, as if summoned by the sentence. My parents walked into the room slowly. My father looked older than he had the night before, his face pale and stiff with tension. My mother's eyes were red as if she had been crying for hours. Chloe stood slightly behind them, her arms folded tightly across her chest. For a moment, no one spoke. My father's gaze shifted from me to the man sitting beside my bed. Recognition flashed across his face. "Dr. Whitaker," he said uncertainly. David stood slowly from the chair. "Yes." My father nodded awkwardly. I recognize you. You spoke at the county hospital conference last year." David's expression remained calm but firm. "And I recognize the situation I found your daughter in," he replied quietly. The room fell silent again. My mother stepped closer to the bed. "Madeline," she said softly, "we didn't think you would actually leave." The sentence hung in the air like a fragile piece of glass. I stared at her, unsure how to respond. David spoke before I could. "She was unconscious in a snowbank during a -15-degree blizzard," he said. "That's not something a child chooses." My father shifted uncomfortably. "There was a misunderstanding," he said. David didn't argue. Instead, he turned slightly toward the hospital social worker who had entered the room quietly during the conversation. "Perhaps this is a good moment for you to speak," he said. The woman introduced herself as Linda Chavez. She pulled a chair closer to the bed and opened a folder filled with papers. "Madeline," she said gently, "I'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened before the accident." My parents remained standing near the doorway as she spoke. At first I hesitated, embarrassed by how unbelievable the story sounded when spoken out loud. But the quiet patience in Linda's voice made it easier. So I told her everything. I described the argument, the recording Chloe had played, the broken necklace, the bruise on her arm. I explained that I had tried to tell them the audio was edited, but no one had listened. Linda wrote notes carefully while nodding from time to time. When I finished, she closed the folder slowly. "Madeline," she said, "you have options." The word surprised me. "What do you mean?" I asked. "You don't have to return somewhere that isn't safe," she explained calmly. My father stepped forward immediately. "Our home is safe," he said. Linda raised a hand gently. "We're simply exploring possibilities." My chest tightened as the reality of the situation settled in. Going back meant returning to the same house where my voice had meant nothing. The idea of that felt heavier than the pain in my ribs. Before I could answer, David spoke quietly from beside the window. "She could stay with me." Everyone in the room turned toward him. Linda looked thoughtful. "You're offering temporary foster placement?" she asked. David nodded. "I lost my daughter several years ago," he said softly. "I know what it means when someone needs a second chance." My parents said nothing. The silence stretched long enough for the weight of the decision to settle fully in my chest. Linda looked back at me. "Madeline, what would you like to do?" The question felt unfamiliar, almost unreal. No one had asked what I wanted in years. I thought about the cold wind outside our house and the porch light switching off. I thought about waking up in this hospital bed to find someone who had stayed beside me all night. "I can't go back," I said quietly. David didn't react with surprise. He simply nodded once as if he had already understood. Linda began explaining the paperwork required for temporary placement, while my parents stood silently near the door. Chloe avoided my eyes the entire time. When they finally left the room, the space felt strangely lighter. As the nurse dimmed the lights that evening, I looked toward the chair where David had returned to sit. He smiled faintly. "Get some rest," he said. We have a lot of rebuilding to do. For the first time since the storm began, I believed that might actually be possible. David Whitaker's house stood at the edge of Willow Creek, a quiet town about 20 minutes from Aspen Hollow. The morning I arrived there, the sky was bright and painfully blue, the kind of clear winter day that appears after a brutal storm has finally passed. Snow still covered the ground in thick white blankets, but the wind had disappeared and the world felt strangely calm. I stood in the driveway, holding the small duffel bag the hospital had given me, unsure how to step into a life that had changed so quickly. David unlocked the front door and held it open for me. "Take your time," he said gently. The house smelled faintly of coffee and old books. Sunlight streamed through wide windows, illuminating shelves filled with medical journals, framed photographs, and small wooden sculptures that looked like handmade gifts. Everything inside felt quiet and steady, the opposite of the chaos I had left behind. "This will be your room," David said as he opened a door at the end of the hallway. The room was simple but warm. A neatly made bed stood beside a wooden desk facing the window. A bookshelf rested against the far wall, half empty as if waiting to be filled. I stepped inside slowly, setting my bag on the floor. "If there's anything you need, we'll figure it out," he added. The word "we" caught my attention. I nodded quietly, unsure how to respond. That first night, I barely slept. Every small noise made me sit up in bed, my body still expecting raised voices or sudden arguments outside the door. But the house remained peaceful. The only sound was the faint hum of the heating system and the occasional creak of the wooden floors settling in the cold. Morning arrived with the smell of toast drifting through the hallway. When I walked into the kitchen, David stood near the stove flipping eggs in a pan. "Good morning," he said with a calm smile. "Eggs or toast?" The question caught me off guard. For a moment, I simply stared at him. "Anything is fine," I replied automatically. David shook his head gently. "That's not an answer." I hesitated, realizing how long it had been since anyone had asked what I preferred. "Toast," I said finally. "Toast it is," he replied. The simplicity of that exchange felt oddly comforting. Over the next few weeks, life began settling into a quiet routine. David helped arrange the legal paperwork so I could continue attending Aspen Hollow High School without disruption. The first day back felt awkward and overwhelming. I expected whispers or curious questions about why I had suddenly moved out of my parents' house. Instead, most students simply treated me like they always had. Lucas met me outside the robotics lab with a look of genuine relief. "You disappeared for days," he said. "Are you okay?" I shrugged lightly. "Long story." He nodded without pushing further. That small gesture meant more than he probably realized. Robotics Club became the one place where everything felt normal again. The lab buzzed with the familiar sounds of laptops, soldering irons, and clattering metal parts. Our team was only weeks away from the Colorado State Robotics Championship, and everyone worked late into the evenings, preparing the robot's final design. David sometimes picked me up after practice, standing patiently near the parking lot with a thermos of hot chocolate waiting in the truck. One evening, as we drove home through the quiet streets of Willow Creek, he glanced over at me thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "talent like yours deserves room to grow." I looked out the window at the snow-covered trees passing under the streetlights. "I'm just trying to finish high school," I replied. David smiled faintly. "That's where most extraordinary things begin." The months passed faster than I expected. Slowly, the fear that had followed me from Aspen Hollow began fading into the background of everyday life. David never pushed me to talk about my family, but when the memories surfaced, he listened without judgment. Sometimes people choose the story that feels easiest to believe, he said once, while we washed dishes together. The truth takes more patience. Those conversations helped me understand something I hadn't realized before. What happened that night in the blizzard was not the end of my life. It was the beginning of a different one. Spring arrived with melting snow and college brochures scattered across my desk. David encouraged me to apply for scholarships I had never even considered. Engineering programs would love a student with robotics competition experience, he said, while reviewing application forms with me at the dining table. I hesitated at first, unsure whether I deserved opportunities that large, but David's confidence never wavered. When the acceptance email finally arrived from Northbridge University, offering a full scholarship in robotics engineering, I stared at the screen in stunned silence. David read the message twice before breaking into a wide grin. I knew it, he said. Absolutely knew it. For the first time in years, I felt something stronger than survival. I felt possibility. College opened doors I hadn't known existed. Robotics engineering turned into artificial intelligence research, and eventually into a technology project focused on helping students with disabilities access education through adaptive learning robots. The idea grew slowly at first, then faster as more universities and schools became interested in the concept. Within a few years, the project expanded into a full company called Aurora Labs. Our robots were being used in classrooms across the country, helping children with physical limitations participate in lessons they would otherwise miss. Through it all, David remained the one constant presence in my life. He attended every major milestone quietly, standing near the back of the room with that same steady smile. By the time I turned 29, Aurora Labs had been invited to present its work at the National Education Innovation Conference in Denver. When the invitation arrived asking me to serve as the keynote speaker, I nearly declined out of instinct. Standing on a stage in front of thousands of people felt intimidating in a way that had nothing to do with technology. But as I read through the conference schedule, one name stopped me cold: Chloe Harper, listed as a student teacher attending the event. For several minutes, I simply stared at the screen. The past I had spent years leaving behind had suddenly appeared again, quietly waiting on the same stage where I was about to speak. The auditorium in Denver was already filled with people when I stepped backstage. Rows of graduates in dark gowns sat near the front, while families filled the seats behind them, holding cameras and flowers, whispering with quiet excitement. The bright lights above the stage hummed softly, and somewhere beyond the curtain, a coordinator was announcing the next segment of the ceremony. I stood near the edge of the hallway, holding the folder with my speech, listening to the distant sound of applause echoing through the room. 13 years had passed since the night my father opened the door and told me to leave. 13 years since I stepped into a -15-degree blizzard, believing my life had just ended. Now I was here by choice, invited to speak about resilience and innovation in education. David Whitaker stood beside me near the wall, adjusting the cuff of his jacket with the same calm focus he had always carried. "You don't have to prove anything today," he said quietly. "Just tell the truth." I nodded once, feeling a steady calm replace the nervous tension that had followed me all morning. When the announcer finally called my name, I walked out onto the stage. The lights were so bright at first that I couldn't see anything beyond the first few rows. Applause rose politely from the audience as I reached the podium and placed my speech folder down. Slowly, my eyes adjusted. Faces began coming into focus. Row after row of students and teachers and parents stretched across the auditorium. Then, my gaze stopped. About 8 rows back, 3 familiar figures sat together: my father, my mother, and Chloe. For a moment they continued clapping like everyone else. Then Chloe's eyes lifted toward the stage and froze. Recognition spread across her face slowly, like a memory forcing its way into the present. My mother followed her gaze a second later. Her hand covered her mouth instantly. My father simply stared forward, completely still. I took a quiet breath and began speaking. "Good afternoon," I said. The microphone carried my voice clearly through the auditorium. Today, I want to talk about resilience, not the kind people celebrate in headlines, but the quiet kind that begins when everything you believed about your life suddenly disappears. The room grew silent. I spoke about a 16-year-old girl living in a small town in Colorado who loved building robots and solving problems. A girl who believed her family would always protect her no matter what happened. Then I described the night a lie changed everything. "One winter evening," I continued, "that girl was forced out of her house during a blizzard. The temperature outside was -15 degrees. The wind was strong enough to erase footprints in seconds. She walked into that storm, believing she had nowhere left to go." A murmur moved through the audience as people leaned forward in their seats. I paused briefly before continuing. "That girl was me." Silence settled across the auditorium so completely that I could hear the faint buzz of the lights above the stage. I didn't look directly at my family again, but I could feel their attention fixed on the podium. "What saved that girl's life," I said, "was not luck. It was a stranger who stopped his truck on a dark road and refused to drive past someone who needed help." I turned slightly toward the front row, where David sat watching quietly. "Dr. David Whitaker," I said, "did more than call an ambulance that night. He stayed long enough to give that girl something she had never been given before. A second chance." Applause broke out across the auditorium as David nodded modestly from his seat. I continued speaking about how opportunity can transform lives when someone chooses compassion over judgment. I described the work Aurora Labs was doing with adaptive learning robots, and how technology could help students who felt invisible in traditional classrooms. The story ended not with anger, but with gratitude. After the ceremony ended, people gathered outside the building beneath the warm afternoon sun. Students posed for photos, while families hugged and laughed. I stepped away from the main crowd toward the quiet side of the plaza where David was waiting. Before I could reach him, 3 figures approached slowly across the pavement. My parents and Chloe stopped a few feet away. For a moment, no one spoke. My father looked older than I remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper. "Madeline," he said quietly. My mother wiped tears from her cheeks. "We didn't know it was you," she whispered. Chloe stepped forward hesitantly. "I lied," she said. Her voice shook slightly. "I was jealous and I wanted Lucas to notice me. I didn't think it would go that far." I listened without interrupting. The wind carried the distant sound of laughter from the other side of the plaza. Finally, I spoke. "I believe you're sorry," I said calmly. Relief flickered across their faces for a brief second. Then I continued gently. "But forgiveness doesn't mean everything returns to the way it was." The silence that followed felt different from the one inside the auditorium. This one held understanding. "I built a life where I feel safe," I explained. "And I have to protect that." My father nodded slowly, his eyes wet. "We're proud of what you've become," he said. Once those words would have meant everything to me. Now they simply existed as something too late to change the past. I wished them well quietly before turning toward David. He was leaning against the car with his hands in his coat pockets, watching patiently. "Ready to go home?" he asked. I smiled for the first time that afternoon. "Yes," I said. As we drove away from the conference center, the Denver skyline faded behind us in the rearview mirror. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The sunlight reflected off the windshield, bright and warm, nothing like the storm that had once defined my life. I realized then that the blizzard which nearly ended my story had also begun it. Every step I took through that snow had led me toward the life I had now. Sometimes storms don't destroy you. Sometimes they reveal the road you were meant to follow all along. And if this story stayed with you, maybe it's because many of us have faced moments where someone chose not to believe us, moments where it felt like the door had closed and the storm outside was too strong to survive. But sometimes all it takes is one person who stops, one person who refuses to walk away, to change everything that comes after. If you've ever experienced something like that, or if someone in your life became the reason you kept going, I'd really like to hear about it. Share your thoughts in the comments, let me know where you're watching from, and if stories about resilience, family, and second chances speak to you, stay with the channel and subscribe so we can keep telling them together.